Shana Tova. When Jared was a little boy, a lot smaller than he was standing up here today, I would read a book to him called Where Do Balloons Go? Written by Jamie Lee Curtis, this book, at the surface, was just about balloons. Where do balloons go when they float far away? Do they tango with airplanes? Do they cha-cha with birds? Do plain balloons read balloons printed with words? When Jared or any other child listened to this book, I imagine that they were just thinking about balloons. And in fact, the story ends with all of the balloons together at a big balloon party. But as a parent and a rabbi, I would ask myself, are the balloons actually a metaphor for people? Is Jamie Lee Curtis writing this book to explore what happens when we die? What happens to us when we die is one of the scariest and awe-inspiring questions, because we all know that it will happen, but nobody has come back to tell us what it's like. I believe there is a corollary, though, to Jamie Lee Curtis's book. Not just what happens to the balloons, but what happens to those of us still here. It is this question that I would like to explore this morning. As we remember our loved ones, how do we continue to live? How do we respond to loss? How do we recognize the blessings in our lives? How do we have the resilience to go on when we experience that loss? So first, how do we respond? As Jews, it is traditional to tear our clothing or a ribbon right before a funeral. We physically acknowledge the pain, but we also respond by being in community, not hiding from others. Through Shiva, we allow the power of our community to lift us up like a rising tide, to keep us afloat in our time of sadness. A friend of mine, another rabbi, Rabbi Nicole Guzik, recently wrote after officiating a funeral, "Through the bonds of faith, we are not alone. Through the ties of friendship and family, we are not alone. Through the pearls of goodness and truth that exist within God's creation, we are not alone." And in thinking about this, I was reminded of the famous poem, Footprints in the Sand. One night, I dreamed a dream. As I was walking across the beach with my God, the dark sky flashed scenes from my life. For each scene, I noticed two sets of footprints in the sand, one belonging to me and one to God. After the last scene of my life, I looked back at the footprints in the sand, and I noticed that at many times along the path of my life, especially the lowest and saddest times, there was only one set of footprints. This troubled me, and I said to God, "God, you said once I decide to follow you, you'd walk with me all the way." But I noticed that during those sad times, there was only one set of footprints. Why, when I needed you most, would you leave me? God whispered, "My precious child, I never left you. When you saw only one set of footprints, it was then that I was carrying you. Most of us don't like feeling like we need help, but there are times that we do. There are times that we need to be lifted up and carried, and we need to allow that to happen. And there will come a time when we must lift up others. For as Martin Luther King Jr. said, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied up in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So the first way we respond after the initial tearing of that garment is by accepting help from our loved ones and our community. Second, we must understand how the people in our lives, most of the time at least, were blessings, and that we can learn from them even after we have lost them. Several weeks ago, I was standing at the graveside of a man who had passed away a year earlier. Though his funeral had been full of friends and congregants, families and admirers, Five-ish Finkel's unveiling was a simple tribute to a man that was larger than life. Surrounded by his sons, daughters-in-law, grandchildren, close family, and close friends, we began the service as a way of honoring his life. As I often do at unveilings, I ask the children if they have anything they would like to share. Elliot and Ian chose to speak not about Five-ish as he had lived, but what they had learned since he died. They proceeded to tell me the story of what the last year has been like. The moments at 11 a.m. where they would reach for the phone to call him, as they always had, only to remember that he wouldn't be able to answer it. The unpacking and cleaning out of boxes, hundreds of boxes at his apartment. As they went through the boxes, they found songs and receipts, letters, and more that showed so much of their parents' lives, even though they thought they already knew everything. This struck me as profound. What does it mean to learn, to love, to live after loss? What blessings can be counted, even in our deepest moments of grief? So after crying out amidst community and realizing that we can still learn from those we have lost, we must think about what is next. How do we have the resilience to go on when we experience a loss, knowing that loss comes in all shapes, forms, contexts, knowing that sometimes we just want what was back? Unfortunately, there is no full recovery from loss. We know that the very thing we want, we can't have. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, a charismatic, brilliant rabbi, once shared a story which illustrated this pain. He tragically lost his adult son in a biking incident. And when reflecting on the words that we say 3 times a day in our Amidah, Mechayeh HaMeitim, God who brings back the dead, during his remarks, Rabbi Greenberg turned to the audience and said, when I say those words, when I recite those prayers, I mean them, literally. I don't read them as metaphor, that my deeds bring back his soul to life, or that memory keeps a person alive. I know all of those explanations, but it's not enough. I don't want JJ's spirit back. I want his body back, and I want to be able to hug my son. This was the simple plea of a sophisticated rabbi turning to a potentially omnipotent God to bring back his dead son. And yet we know that we cannot have them back like that. So now what do? We pray, we remember, and we find a way to be resilient. In Sheryl Sandberg's recent book, Option B, a book that she wrote following the sudden death of her husband, she challenges us to understand that loss often starts with death as a concept, but is in fact much broader than that. She shares, I don't know anyone who has been handed only roses. We all encounter hardships. Some we see coming, others take us by surprise. It can be as tragic as the sudden death of a child, as heartbreaking as a relationship that unravels, or as disappointing as a dream that goes unfulfilled. So what do we do next? She answers her own question by reminding us that we must be resilient. Since resilience is the strength and speed of our response to adversity, we need to build it. She says it isn't about having a backbone, it's about strengthening the muscles around our backbone. One of my favorite authors, Anna Quindlen, gives language to this. She says what is really hard, really amazing, is giving up on being perfect and beginning the work of becoming yourself. That eventually being perfect became like carrying a backpack filled with bricks every single day. And Quindlen says, today is the day to put down that backpack before you develop permanent curvature of the spirit. There is no such thing as perfect, but we need to figure out how to be resilient in the face of loss, to learn amidst our grief, to find a way to move through that grief. We will never get over loss. If somebody tells you you will get over it, walk away from them. You don't need to be stoic in your loss. Acknowledging that loss is a real human emotion to embrace. So how do we build up our spiritual muscles to be resilient? Last year, Dr. Dennis Charney, a resilience researcher, yes, there is such thing, a resilience researcher and dean of the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai here in New York, was leaving a deli when he was shot by a disgruntled employee. Dr. Charney spent 5 days in intensive care and faced a challenging recovery where he learned what resilience really required, and so he decided to write about. He wrote, "Practice optimism. Optimism doesn't mean ignoring the reality of a dire situation. But while it sounds trivial, thinking positive thoughts and surrounding yourself with positive people really does work. Remember your comebacks. When times are tough, we often remind ourselves that other people, like war refugees or friends with cancer, have it worse. While that may be true, you will get a bigger resilience boost by reminding yourself of the challenges that you have overcome. Support others. Resilience studies show that people are more resilient when they have a strong support network of friends and family. But you can get even a bigger boost by supporting somebody else. Go out of your comfort zone. Build your resilience by trying something new. Greg Popovich of the San Antonio Spurs teaches, the measure of who we are is how we react to something that doesn't go our way. So after remembering our loved ones and learning from them, finding a way to be strong again, we can begin to think about joy, and we don't need to be guilty about that. As Sandberg says, whether you see joy as a discipline, an act of defiance, a luxury, or a necessity, it is something that everyone deserves. Joy allows us to go on living and loving and being there for others. In Rabbi Levy's recent book, Einstein and the Rabbi, she explores how we access our soul so that we can be the best version of ourselves. She writes about coping with loss. She told a story that in many ways brings me back to the balloons. When her mother was dying, her mother still wanted to hear every day about what Naomi was up to. If she was traveling out of town, she'd get a call in the taxi on the way to the airport. We'd talk, and then I'd say, "Mom, I have to go. I'm going through security." She'd say, "Okay, call me on the other side." I'd call, we'd sit, we'd chat. Levy recalls that as her mother was laying in her final moments, Naomi reached out to her mother. She writes, "I blessed her. Mom, everything you needed to give, you've already given. You can go now." I stroked her hair, I sang her a lullaby, and as she slipped into unconsciousness, I whispered to myself, "Call me when you get through security." In reflecting on loss, Levy wrote, "When someone close to you dies, the normal world says, 'Get back to normal.' But we all know it takes longer than that. And eventually we will learn how to be with them even without them. We will be strong even in the face of loss. We will respond with grace and with courage and strength even when we have nothing left. For Judaism teaches, Be'erev yalin bechi, v'laboker rina. Weeping tarries for the night, but joy comes in the morning. We can and we will emerge." As we begin our transition to Yizkor, here is a final story about a 41-year-old named Brian Zaslow. A few weeks ago, Brian shared the following. "I woke up like most in New York did at 25 years old. I waved down a New York Waterway ferry bus and took it down to the ferry terminal on 40th in the Hudson River. I was excited, anxious, pumped, not only for the interview that I was headed for, but also excited to celebrate afterwards with my father, Ira. We were going to have lunch together. I approached the ticket machine at the ferry terminal, bought my round-trip ticket to Weehawken, New Jersey, and boarded the boat. As we found our way across the river, I stood outside the boat on a gorgeous fall morning. It was 8:45 a.m. on that gorgeous morning as a plane raced across the sky directly over my boat. It felt so close. I became frozen, just like so many others around me, as I watched this jet race over my head and take aim at Lower Manhattan. That plane didn't feel right, didn't sound right. It seemed so out of place, and all of a sudden it was crashing into the North Tower, my father's tower, where he spent every day of his professional life for the last 11 years working for Lehman Brothers. Time stopped for me at that moment. Weeks on end went by, and I walked like a zombie through New York City, searching, but always knowing in my heart that the moment I watched that plane hit the building, he was gone. The only employee that Lehman Brothers lost that day was my father, Ira. Fast forward 16 years, and each day I wake up. The memory of my father supports my efforts to get up and to create the best day and life I can possibly have. I had a choice 16 years ago. I could choose to remember the horrible, senseless murder of my father and live a life of excuses. Or I could live a life like my father always wanted for me and seize each day with a zest for life and become the driving force in all that I do. You can live in the past, or you can live in the present, having learned from the past, and create a much brighter future. Allow today to be a day that propels you forward and encourages you to live a bigger, brighter, and more powerful life. So, like Yitz Greenberg, Naomi Levy, Brian Zaslow, and so many others, who are you remembering today? Think about them. Remember what they taught you. Let us recall their lives, remember their love, and respond to their loss, and so we can be resilient for the sake of their memory. And in doing so, we will make their memories a true blessing. Gamar Chatima Tova.